During the Second World War, many commanders stood up to the task and led their men towards victory. Yet, there are some generals who performed miserably. Their poor decisions ended up wasting countless lives and making the war an ordeal for their subordinates. These are the worst generals of World War II. 6. Maxime Weygand. Small in stature, weighing only 120 pounds, and standing but 5 feet tall, Weygand was a French military commander who served in both world wars. Born in Belgium but raised in France, he was educated at the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. Serving as a staff officer to General Ferdinand Foch during World War I, he later served as military advisor to Poland in the Polish-Soviet War and served as High Commissioner of the Levant. Appointed Chief of Staff of the French Army in 1931, he retired in 1935 but was recalled in May 1940 to command the French Army during the German invasion. The military situation in France was dire following the German attack. Maurice Gamelin, the supreme commander, was dismissed due to the disastrous state of affairs. Maxime Weygand, a political neutral, was recalled from Syria to take over the position of supreme commander of the French army. Upon Weygand's arrival on May 17th, he canceled a flank counteroffensive ordered by Gamelin, losing the opportunity to destroy the overextended German spearheads. Eventually, he did attempt a counterattack, but it was too late, as the German infantry had already caught up with their tanks. Weygand then tried to form the so-called Weygand Line, but the Allied forces were largely trapped in Belgium by this point. As the German offensive continued in force, Weygand met with Charles de Gaulle, who advocated for continuing the fight. However, Weygand seemed resigned to defeat, believing France would soon fall and hoping to maintain order after an armistice. Italy's entry into the war on June 10th further worsened the French military situation. On June 11th, Weygand participated in an Anglo-French conference discussing options for continuing the war effort. Despite some voices demanding continued resistance, Weygand ultimately demanded an armistice. The French government moved to Bordeaux on June 14th, where discussions about surrender intensified. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud proposed laying down arms and continuing the fight from abroad, but Weygand vehemently opposed this, deeming it a shameful surrender. Eventually, a compromise was reached to approach the Germans about armistice terms. Following Reynaud's resignation on June 16th, Marshal Pétain became Prime Minister, and Weygand joined the new government as Minister of Defense. The course was set for France to negotiate an armistice with Germany. On the 22nd of June 1940, the second armistice at Compiègne was signed by France and Germany. Following France's defeat, Weygand served in the Vichy government and held positions in the collaborationist regime, for which he would be arrested and trialed after the war's end. 5. Lloyd Fredendall. General Lloyd R. Fredendall was an American military officer who served during World War II. He gained prominence during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Fredendall's leadership style was characterized as outspoken, rough, and inclined to jump to conclusions. He often used informal language and made up baffling codes, leading to confusion among his subordinates. Despite his shortcomings, he was chosen to command the 39,000-man-strong Central Task Force during Operation Torch. During the advance into Tunisia, Fredendall's leadership was marked by questionable decisions, including building an elaborate headquarters bunker far from the front lines and rarely visiting the troops. He also split up units and positioned them poorly for mutual support, leading to criticism from his subordinates. The Battle of Kasserine Pass revealed Fredendall's deficiencies as a commander, with Eisenhower eventually replacing him with General George S. Patton. Fredendall's tenure was marked by his inability to properly coordinate and integrate forces under his command, leading to a lack of air support and conflicting orders. Fredendall was the first American Corps commander relieved of command during World War II. He was criticized by his subordinates and peers, with some accusing him of cowardice and incompetence. After his removal from North Africa, Fredendall was reassigned to a less important role within the military. he eventually retired from active duty in 1946, having reached the rank of lieutenant general. 4. Semyon Budyonny. Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny was a Soviet cavalryman and military leader known for his roles in the Russian Civil War, Polish-Soviet War, and World War II. He was also a close political ally of Joseph Stalin. Budyonny was a strong advocate of horse cavalry and opposed the concept of an independent tank corps. He considered the idea illogical and even as sabotaging the military efforts. Despite being repeatedly informed about the significance of tanks for future wars, he remained unconvinced, famously stating,
"You won't convince me. As soon as war is declared, everyone will shout, 'Send for the cavalry.'"
As Operation Barbarossa commenced on the 22nd of June 1941, Semyon Budyonny served as the commander-in-chief of the Soviet armed forces in the southwestern direction. Tasked with facing the German invasion in Ukraine, Budyonny operated under Stalin's strict orders not to retreat under any circumstances. Due to following this directive, Budyonny's forces were eventually surrounded during the Battle of Uman and the Battle of Kiev by Wehrmacht forces. The disasters which followed the encirclement cost the Soviet Union 1.5 million men killed or taken prisoner, the largest encirclement in military history. Following these failures, Stalin relieved Budyonny of his command on the 13th of September 1941, replacing him with Semyon Timoshenko. Budyonny was subsequently relegated to less significant roles, such as leading the reserve front and commanding troops in the North Caucasus direction, where he was eventually removed as the Germans approached. Despite his previous achievements and public popularity, stemming from his role as a cavalry commander during the Russian Civil War, Budyonny's fellow officers regarded him as incompetent in leading armies in a mechanized war. Marshal Konev, among others, criticized Budyonny's lack of knowledge and incompetence in military matters. However, due to his exceptional record in the Civil War and his continued patronage by Stalin, Budyonny faced no significant repercussions for the disasters in Ukraine. 3. Arthur Percival. Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival, a distinguished British Army officer, served in the First World War and established a successful military career in the interwar period. However, he is mostly remembered for his leadership during the Second World War, notably his command of British forces during the Malayan Campaign. In April 1941, Percival was promoted to acting lieutenant general and appointed as the general officer commanding Malaya, a significant promotion given his limited experience in commanding Army Corps. Despite having inadequate forces and having to defend a broad coastline from a potential Japanese landing, Percival worked to train his troops and improve defensive capabilities. As tensions escalated in the region, particularly after the Japanese occupation of southern Indochina, Percival continued preparations for a potential conflict. Nevertheless, the Japanese invasion of Malaya began on December 8, 1941. Initially landing in the northern part of Malaya, the Japanese troops quickly advanced southwards. Percival issued orders for a general retreat across the Johor Strait to Singapore, where he organized a defense along the island's coast. However, deceiving Percival, the Japanese landed on the northwestern part of Singapore Island on February 8, 1942. After a week of fighting with dwindling ammunition and supplies, Percival agreed to surrender, despite earlier instructions from Prime Minister Winston Churchill for prolonged resistance. The Japanese insisted that Percival himself march under a white flag to negotiate the surrender. Shockingly, 130,000 Allied personnel surrendered or were killed by fewer than 30,000 Japanese. Accordingly, the defeat in Malaya and Singapore is often cited as one of the darkest moments in British military history. Percival's staggering failure to prepare an adequate defensive plan was the subject of a famous book, On the Psychology of Military Incompetence. 2. Mark Clark. Mark Wayne Clark was a United States Army officer who saw service during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. He was the youngest four-star general in the U.S. Army during the Second World War. Being the commander of American forces landing in continental Italy, in September 1943, Clark hesitated on breaking out after his initial landing, which nearly let the Germans push the Allies back into the sea. Then, in January 1944, in a glory-seeking effort to take the strategically critical abbey of Monte Cassino, he sent an understrength infantry division on a dangerous river crossing against dug-in German defenses. Predictably, the division was nearly wiped out, and Clark was later the subject of a congressional inquiry. Finally, Clark's troops had the elite German 10th Army on the run after breaking out of the Anzio landing. But at that critical moment, Clark switched gears to capture Rome, despite it having no strategic value. Rome was taken with no resistance, and Clark rode in as a conqueror. But the bulk of the German force escaped, necessitating nearly another year of vicious combat to advance through Italy, and 44,000 more Allied casualties. Clark's failure to follow orders and the perceived waste of lives led correspondent Alan Wicker to observe, if he had been German, Hitler would have had him shot. 1. Maurice Gamelin. A decorated commander during World War I, Gamelin was the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces at the start of the Second World War. He believed the Maginot Line would keep Germany out of France, and that they'd have to cut through Belgium, exactly like they did in the First World War. Germany did indeed go through Belgium, but through the thick Ardennes forest, which Gamelin ordered to be left virtually undefended. Despite receiving intelligence indicating German intentions to bypass the Maginot Line and attack through the Ardennes, Gamelin hesitated to redeploy forces to counter this threat. He underestimated the speed and strength of the German advance, delaying critical decisions and barely sending any reinforcements to the strategically important area around Sedan. Gamelin ordered his best troops into Belgium north of the main strike, falling into a trap the Germans thoroughly planned. Some of the best French forces, alongside the British Expeditionary Force, stayed there for days, doing very little fighting. Meanwhile, German troops cut through the thin lines held by reservists at Sedan and sprinted towards the English Channel. Realizing his mistake, Gamelin ordered his troops to head south, but inexplicably continued to delay on launching a full counterattack. This led to more than 400,000 Allied soldiers being encircled in northern France, a decision which could have single-handedly won the war for Germany. Therefore, having proven totally incapable of fighting off the German attack, Gamelin was sacked after just 8 days of combat. So, what do you think? Who was the worst general of the Second World War? Tell us in the comments section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. There are many more coming at Study of War.